Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. China's state media has released a video detailing the clash between People's Liberation Army troops and the Indian Army in Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. The clash in June 2020 had left at least 20 Indian soldiers, including the commanding officer of the battalion, dead. We now know from the released video that PLA lost 4 soldiers in that clash. Earlier, Russian news outlet TASS had claimed the PLA had lost 45 soldiers in the clash. The video came out as the two sides began the disengagement process on the southern and northern banks of Pangong So, a high-altitude lake. Indian analysts say the video was put out because there was anger in China about the PLA casualties, especially after the TASS report. The video, however, shows that Indian troops arrived at the clash point in at least a battalion strength. They were in riot gear, holding shields with police written on them, and were carrying clubs. They waded through the river, were aggressive. The Chinese troops in the area were greatly outnumbered at that point. We can see a Chinese officer, probably the commanding officer, reason with the Indian troops. The video then cuts to PLA reinforcements arriving in the area. Daylight is gone and one can see silhouettes of soldiers clashing. Let's get to our panel and try to reconstruct the events. We would also like to know about the timing of the video, the Chinese decision to disengage in the Pangong So area. Will disengagement along the lake and its spurs, referred to as fingers, be the beginning of disengagement at other points in Ladakh? I am joined by Einar Tangen, a political and economic affairs commentator in Beijing, and Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C. So thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Ms. Tangen here. Ms. Tangen, what about the timing of the video and what the Indian analysts are saying that this has been released primarily because there was anger? There was a TASS report which said the PLA had lost about 45 soldiers. So therefore, the government had to release this video through state media and also posthumously honor the soldiers who had lost their lives. Is that assessment correct, or is there some other reason for releasing the video?
Well, it's quite a different reason. I appeared on numerous Indian stations last week where they were proclaiming that they had won this, quote, war. They had taught China a lesson, that China had retreated, that China had been bloodied. There was all sorts of jingoistic comments, some racist, indicating that, Chinese are distrustworthy. They blamed the Chinese and said that it was the Chinese who had started the entire affair and that they were in the right at all times. This video shows the contrary. Now, we don't know exactly what it was. Obviously, the PLA is putting this out as to bolster its claim that it was not the aggressor in this, that it was acting defensively, that the reason that these chaps died was because of an action by these very aggressive Indian troops.
Right. I'm going to return to you and frankly would like to know how your appearances on the Indian channels went, but let me pull in Dr. Kamran Bokhari here. Kamran Bokhari, from the video, what we see is that there is a tent pitched already on one of the banks of the Galwan River, and then we see some Indian troops bringing another tent over, and then someone from the Chinese side says in Chinese, but they've got the, there's a translation of that, which says they're bringing in another tent. And then we see lots of people, lots of soldiers in riot gear wading through the river, and then there's a shot of the Chinese officer who's trying to reason with them. So let's try and reconstruct. We do know from what the Indian military had said at that point was that they said that we were going to go to what they call the patrol point 14, which is the point up to which Indians had been patrolling in Galwan. What is your sense of what this video shows?
Well, it's difficult to completely reconstruct Ijaz, but if one has to sort of make that attempt, it does appear that the Chinese are trying to bring out their story, and you don't just issue a video if that's not your intent. So I think that what they're trying to do is trying to say, look, a lot has been said about this, but this is how it happened from their point of view, and they're trying to sort of sell it to the world because they're competing with the Indian narrative. And mind you, what is interesting here is that this is the first time since the event, which goes back to late spring of last year. So that's quite a bit of time has gone by, and for the Chinese to now come out with all of this suggests that there is some need, some pressure to actually come out with their own story. And you just mentioned in your report that they actually only recently acknowledged that 4 soldiers of theirs lost their lives in this clash. So look, if we were to reconstruct, one thing is clear that and this is in the Indian media as well, that the Indians were caught off guard by the fact that their troops were no longer able to patrol up to a certain point. And I think that's where they realized that the Chinese had made an ingress and created an advanced post, and therefore they needed to go and confront it. That's what militaries usually do. And I think when they also realized that they couldn't just do it without bringing in heavy reinforcements, which that would sort of dovetail with what the Chinese are trying to say, look, this is our position. And then the Indians brought a tank, and you have the commanding officer saying, they're bringing in more. So I think that if the Indians were surprised, they tried to retake it. And that's where it is. But, to say who started it, who didn't start it, that video isn't sufficient. It's clear from my point of view that the Indian inability to actually do their normal patrolling that they were able to do up until that point suggests that the Chinese had advanced into newer territory. Now, whether that's Indian or Chinese, those are sort of claims, and I won't get into that, but it's clear that there was territory taken from the Indians at that point.
Right. Before I go back to Mr. Tangen, here's the thing, Kamran Bokhari. What we see from the video, and once again, videos can be doctored, so one can't be sure unless one actually performs deep forensics on it. But from what we witness is that at that particular point, which according to Indians is patrol point 14, there is Chinese presence, but greatly outnumbered by the swarms of people, soldiers who are coming in. That's very clear from the video. And at least 2 of these, so what we see is that as they're wading through the river, we see first one Chinese soldier sort of go forward and raise his hands like this and saying, well, you can't move any further. And then there's another one. And so one of the soldiers in the lead actually comes and pushes the Chinese soldier who's trying to stop him. And then we see another wave of soldiers come in. And then there is, of course, some negotiation, and then Chinese reinforcements and all that. And as I said, then daylight. This all began during daylight, and then, the clash probably took place at night, as reported earlier also. So it does seem to me that at some point, the Chinese had decided that the Indians cannot patrol up to patrol point 14. Is that kind of reconstruction you think is plausible, acceptable?
Because, you have to understand that why would the Indians, send in such a large number of troops to retake or take or whatever without, and knowing, it's not like when they got there, they found out, oh my God, the Chinese are sitting here. They knew that they were there, and they knew that they needed to go in and dislodge them. It was a clear attempt at dislodging, and it failed. But you see, that's the moment captured in that video. What are the other moments around it? What is that? That's not the beginning and the end of the episode. That's a snapshot within that broader episode. And so the broader episode still, unless there's some other evidence that comes out, incontrovertible, and says otherwise, it does seem that the Indians were caught off guard, and they tried to, fix the situation to their satisfaction using force, thinking that, they would be able to do this. They wouldn't. They weren't able to do that. It led to the clash. Lots of lives lost, on about 20 on the Indian side, and according to the Chinese, there's 4. We don't know, to the extent that how many got wounded or what. These are numbers that we have to live with, and so all of this suggests that there was a move by the Chinese to do an ingress. They were successful. The Indians came in. They tried to dislodge and revert the situation back to status quo ante, whatever that was. And it didn't happen, and everything flew from there. And then we had tensions, and finally, more recently, we had this sort of disengagement agreement that still seems to be playing out.
Right. Before I go back to Mr. Tangen, a couple of things that we know for a fact. 20 Indian soldiers were killed in the clash. 10 were made POWs, out of which 7 were officers. This is one fact that we know. The other fact that we know, again from the Indian media, that this particular battalion was tasked to go in and evict the Chinese from patrol point 14. So, Mr. Tangen, you heard our attempt to sort of reconstruct this, and you also heard Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Is there something you would like to add to this? And in particular, I'm interested in, as Kamran said, the Chinese want to come out with their story. Why now? I mean, why not come out with the story when it actually happened, if it's about countering the Indian narrative?
Okay, let's begin at the part. I don't think that Dr. Kamran covered it completely. Let's put it in context. This was not just an attack out of the blue. What had happened, there had been days, weeks of negotiations that had been going on. And then you had this incursion by a colonel. I've asked on Indian TV to government spokesmen, et cetera, who ordered that colonel to do that, because the generals were the ones who were in the room negotiating. He took it upon himself, or on orders, to take his men across that stream. Obviously, they were armed with sticks and shields, as we can see. The Chinese were not. And they decided to try to dislodge the Chinese. They kicked over their tent. That was uncontroverted. It was said in the Indian press, yes, we took their tent down. And this caused a scuffle. Why? Because that's what soldiers do. You do not go over and kick their tent down and expect them to just kind of run away. It's not what they're trained to do. So you had a very unfortunate loss of life. But why did China not bring it forward? It's very simple. They were trying to downplay the situation. What they didn't want was counting body bags on both sides, inflaming public opinion, and getting on the brink of war. China has not been the aggressor here. Remember, the other part of this context is that in Jammu and Kashmir, when they in essence, absorbed it into India, they redrew maps. Those maps were very threatening to Chinese efforts, also to Pakistan, to Nepal, all right, and also Chinese held a Saki Chin. Basically, then you had a follow-up where a senior minister, the home minister, stood up in the Lok Sabha and said that he would not rest until all of the lands in the maps were returned to India. Then you had, in conjunction with that, this very expedited road building going along there. The Chinese have a long memory. They remember 1962, and what they observed then is that a leader at that time thought that he could just slowly inch his way in. And for whether it was populist reasons or whatever, the Chinese rebuffed it. And they rebuffed it very well. And it's been a point of contention ever since. It was a humiliation for India. I wish it had never happened. It would be much easier to sort this thing out. But China has not been looking to inflame tensions. But when they saw everything that was happening on Indian TV last week, saying that China had been defeated, that their nose had been bloody, that they were, running away from the superior Indian forces, I think that became a little bit too much. It's not that Chinese watch Indian TV, but, the Chinese have their own sense of pride. And this idea that after you've signed, in essence, a withdrawal agreement, that the other side runs around screaming that they've won, a little bit too much to bear.
Dr. Bokhari, Mr. Tangen is making a very important point and he's right, because, obviously it's occupational hazard for me to also monitor Indian media. There was indeed, this sort of the narrative that was being put out, especially with reference to disengagement in Pangong, so that Chinese basically withdrew helter-skelter. There was also the sense that because the Indians had occupied these heights in Rezenla and Rachinla, which they call the RR sector, and also some of the heights on the northern bank, on some of the spurs, overlooking the Chinese positions. And so therefore, the Chinese had no option but to disengage. So that was a kind of narrative that was being pushed. Now, you being an observer of military and intelligence affairs, give me a sense of how you look at this particular disengagement. And as I said in my opening, is this going to be replicated elsewhere also, for instance, in Depsang or in Galwan or Gogra or Hot Springs, where the Chinese are still at a great advantage?
I don't think so. I'll answer your last question first. I don't think so, because, look, this is probably the epicenter, if you will, if I can use that word, of that entire clash. And it was a military sense to do it. It made military sense to disengage and cool down things and return to some semblance of normalcy. But this is just, what is disengagement? Disengagement is just saying, okay, you know what, we've been at a heightened state of alert. We have our forces eyeball to eyeball with yours. We're just going to, disengage, lower the temperature, and that's about it. Does that mean that everything is forgotten, that they're going to start replicating this in other areas? Not necessarily. There may be areas where it may be to the advantage of both sides to not have to continue to maintain that high state of alert, because it costs, there's a lot of logistics involved, money, keeping troops in that area. Is it worth it? Is it not worth it? These are calculations that have to be made and will be made. But I don't think that this is going to be like the trend line, because there's clearly certain areas, and as my co-panelist, Mr. Tangen, mentioned, there is the road, the DSDBO road that the Indians have been building, and that's not something the Chinese are going to say, oh, okay, we're just going to forget about that, and we're just going to, in the spirit of disengagement, ignore that. No, that's not going to happen. It depends, what area and how the Chinese are perceiving it, where they don't want to disengage pressure from, and where they want to maintain pressure, because you need to maintain leverage. Because this is slow motion. This is in slow motion. This conflict has been going on for decades, and we're in a new situation, especially post Galwan and everything that happened last May or June. In fact, some reports suggest that even started in April, as early as late April. So the Chinese did not engage in this kind of action just to sort of pull back. So as for the narrative side, I really don't put stock into too much, what is said in terms of jingoism on TV and claims and all of that. I don't think that the Chinese are necessarily worried about what the Indians are saying. Look, most of their population doesn't even understand what's going on, if you will, in the local level, in the local language in India. Now, English news channels is a different thing. They do listen to it. How much stock does their population put into it? How much pressure does that put on the Chinese government? These are all questions that we don't have answers for. So I'm not going to say that it's because the need to counter the Indian narrative, because the Indian narrative had been building, perhaps not this narrative that, hey, look, they disengaged because they couldn't face the claimed might of the Indian army and a show of bravado. But look, the Indian narrative has been building for months. So I'm still very interested for something more to come out of the Chinese to say, this is why we did it. I haven't seen anything, and it still remains a mystery in terms of why now the timing. I mean, maps are built, and they've been published and issued for ages. Aksai Chin is always seen as part of India. I've never seen an Indian map that says otherwise. So those reasons, really, I'm having a hard time buying those reasons.
Right. That's for Mr. Tangen to respond to. Mr. Tangen, Dr. Kamran Bokhari is not particularly, satisfied with some of the reasons that have been, that we have talked about in relation to the release of the video. And he's also said that Indian maps have been showing Aksai Chin as part of India forever, so why now?
Well, obviously he's more informed about Indian security situations than Chinese. We're on the eve of the two sessions. This is the 5-year plan that's being put into place. This is the coming year of the 100th anniversary of China. They take great pride in the fact that they have shook off colonial aggression. They put a lot of stock in holding their territory. This idea that somehow it's okay to run in and try to humiliate and make PLA forces look puny and stupid, I think he should recalibrate that. The PLA forces have been reorganized largely under Xi Jinping. They did away with the kind of troop units that they had before. They used to have these fourth armies and these regiments and things like that with glorious histories. They, in essence, did away. They professionalized it, but they're certainly not going to be, minimized or take it on the chin for some sort of political reason. I do believe that Beijing was just fed up with this nonsense narrative that they had been backed into a corner and, had been running in fear for their life. Now, everyone understands that from Modi's point of view, he's under attack by Rahul Gandhi, who is trying to spread this narrative that India gave up land, and therefore it's to his political benefit to say that he's humiliated China. But that is not something that's playing well in Beijing.
Right. Give me a sense of, just to sort of, a segue of sorts, but President Joe Biden's first foreign policy announcement, if you will, when he spoke at the State Department, talked about Myanmar, of course, for a completely different reason, but named 2 states very clearly, i.e. China and Russia, in terms of the threat perception. So it seems that not much is likely to change on the US-China front with President Trump gone. I think we now have a president who's looking at rebuilding a larger anti-China coalition. Is that a sense that you would agree with?
Yes, I mean, that's the rhetoric that Joe Biden has been putting out, largely under pressure. Remember, China is going to be the #1 political issue at the midterms and also at the next presidential election. What the Republicans have promised that they are going to use this as a battering ram. Remember, in 3.5 years from now, China will be stronger, the U.S. relatively weaker. And they're going to say, look, you let the Democrats in, they're soft on China. And this is really the #1 strategy that they have. So Biden is kind of boxed in. But if you start looking at his international forays, not domestic, but internationally, if you want climate change action, if you want to distribute COVID-19 vaccines, if you want to have an economic plan that can address the issues of the world on a holistic basis, if you want to have peacekeepers out there, anti-piracy, fighting terrorism, I would love to know how you can do that without the cooperation of both China and U.S. and to a large extent Russia. Even right now, the U.S. does not have a trade agreement. They sat out the TPP and the RCEP. So did India. So they're now in a situation where they, for the first time, are not the movers and shakers on the trade scene since World War II. And they have to try to claw back. The WTO is an obvious one. Biden has tremendous leverage in terms of lifting his hold on appointing these appellate judges necessary to render final judgments. He could do some things there in terms of trying to create some reforms, much needed by everybody. But once again, he has to have the cooperation of not only the rest of the countries, but China and Russia. So at this juncture, internationally, all roads lead to multilateral organizations and cooperation, whereas the political rhetoric at home does not. But keep in mind one aspect that might be the balancing one. The amount of money that's pouring into China as we speak and has been for the last 6 months as China has recovered and the rest of the world has not is astounding. All right, China has a digital currency. Money, it goes like water to where it can. And right now it's traveling to China, and that is not likely going to stop. So at some point, that power and money comes together. And I'd anticipate that there will be some sort of realignment as business tries to reassert its interest, because without business, there aren't jobs. Without jobs, no prosperity.
Right. It's an interesting point. I have a couple of minutes left. Dr. Kamran Bokhari, you want to add something to what Mr. Tangen is saying with U.S.-China relations under President Biden?
Yes, look, I think that at the end of the day, there can be differences in style, but the substantive conversation remains the same, whether it was Trump or, it's Biden now. The United States has to have a China policy. This is not something new. And they're going to be working on this. This is the number one foreign policy. It's very clear from American writings and statements from American politicians. Every behavior of the United States shows that they're looking at China and the rise of China as the number one foreign policy challenge, and it's disengaging from other parts of the world in order to meet this challenge. So look, it doesn't mean there's going to be conflict tomorrow, but there are lots of points of tensions. And again, this isn't something this is natural when there is a superpower and then there is a rising power. You do have these situations where their interests, will collide, and they either manage it or they can't, in which case, and I'm not saying that's about to happen anytime soon, in which case, there's going to be more tensions and there's going to be potential clashes and conflicts. But we're not there yet, and this is the long road. And I think that for the next several decades, U.S.-China relations and what becomes of them is going to determine security and stability and economic prosperity in the world, because at the end of the day, China is the largest manufacturing nation in the world, and that means quite a bit for commerce and trade around the globe. So all of these things have to be taken into account. There's already lots of grievances on the American side, and as powers rise, which in the case of China it is, and it will assert itself. Once it asserts itself, we will see a lot of clashes. The clashes in Kashmir are part and parcel of that. We see this in the South China Sea. We see this in the increased friction in the Straits of Taiwan and on other fronts that are not necessarily military.
Right. Thank you so much. A lot discussed, but I've run out of time. Thank you to Mr. Einar Tangen. Thank you, Dr. Kamran Bokhari. We'll take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Myanmar. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Myanmar is again under the jackboot. Military leaders overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government on 1st February and have placed her under house arrest, charging her with possessing illegal walkie-talkies, indeed, and violating the country's national disaster law. This despite the fact that Ms. Suu Kyi has been widely blamed for a less than humanitarian policy towards the Rohingya Muslims. The country has seen weeks of protests since the coup. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Myanmar in one of the largest demonstrations yet on Monday against the country's military coup. Businesses closed as employees joined a general strike, despite a military statement that said protesters were risking their lives by turning out. The statement prompted fears the protests could turn violent, but they remained peaceful throughout Monday, though at least one protester, a 20-year-old woman, was shot in the head and died. The country gained independence from Britain in 1948. It was ruled by the military from 1962 until 2011, when a new government began ushering in a return to civilian rule. Protesters are demanding an end to the military's rule and want Ms. Suu Kyi released, along with senior members of her National League for Democracy party. In his first foreign policy address at the State Department, U.S. President Joe Biden mentioned Burma, Myanmar, expressing his administration's concern over events in that country. Last Thursday, at the Foreign Ministers' online meeting of the Quad, Japan's Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi expressed Tokyo's grave concern over the coup and subsequent human rights violations by the junta. Japan is the biggest donor to Myanmar. To discuss the situation further, I'm joined by Bridget Welsh, currently Honorary Research Associate with the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute, Malaysia, based in Kuala Lumpur, and Simon Billenness, Executive Director, International Campaign for the Rohingya, and Director, No Business with Genocide. He joins me from Washington, D.C. Dr. Welsh, this is not new. Myanmar has seen the jackboot before. Well, what exactly prompted this? I mean, this whole business of walkie-talkies, frankly, draws a chuckle, but why did this happen now?
There are three reasons that people talked about why this coup has happened. First of all, they point to the personal ambition of the commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing, who would have been forced to retire in July of this year. This allows him to keep on positioning and staying in power. The second factor is that the election in November really weakened the representation of the military parties, the USDP. And this would have meant that the military would have had less influence in the legislature, even though they would have held on to 25% of the seats, which is mandatory in the Constitution. It would not have been as much as they would have wanted, and it would have potentially weakened their power and opened the opportunity for more constitutional amendments that might have actually weakened their power further. And I think the third factor is that the military as an institution has felt that they don't have as much political power more generally in Myanmar, even though they maintained a lot of it. And so in terms of the threats to their businesses and others that are being challenged, I think that the military has responded the way it has through this coup.
Right. It's very well explained. Mr. Billenness, let me pull you in on this. As I said in my opening, Ms. Suu Kyi faced a lot of criticism because she was seen to be following a policy on the Rohingya that sailed very close to what the military wanted. So she was essentially being looked at as someone who was placating the military, but apparently that wasn't enough, given the three reasons that Dr. Welsh presented to us. Give me your sense of how you look at the situation.
I think that it's been made very clear that Aung San Suu Kyi's policy of accommodation and cooperation with this brutal, corrupt, genocidal military has been a complete failure. And what we're seeing now is the people of Myanmar rising up, and they're rising up to do away with military rule. They're calling for the 2008 constitution that the military wrote to be set aside. They want the military completely out of politics. They want the military completely out of the economy. And it's a movement that this military coup has in many ways inspired, and it's a reaction against the military's heavy-handed, corrupt, brutal rule that we've seen basically since 1962.
Right. So these protests clearly indicate they're peaceful, but people seem to be very firm about what you're saying in terms of what the military's role should be. And they're saying it should not have a political role, it should not be part of the country's economy. But we also saw major protests in 1988, if I'm not wrong about the year. But nothing really seemed to change. At the end of the day, if the commander-in-chief is going to retire and decides that no, he doesn't want to retire, if the military thinks that politically it's losing out, if it thinks that economically the pie is getting smaller, it'll just move in and do what it has done for so many years. So is there something different this time that you can perceive as opposed to previously?
Yeah, the thing that's different right now is that the Myanmar economy is so much more integrated with the world economy. Communications in Myanmar are very different from 1988. We have the internet. We have the ability of these young people in Myanmar to communicate instantly with the outside world. And the military can't close that down entirely. The Myanmar economy depends on the internet. The banking system is on the internet. If they close down the internet completely, then they've closed down the economy completely, so they can't do it. That's what's different right now. And this is a very different generation. This 21 generation is very different from the 88 generation. They're much more savvy about communicating with the outside world. They've got connections. I'm talking with people inside Burma all the time who are giving us information on the Myanmar military's business interests and the foreign investors who are collaborating with them. And so what we're seeing is a movement, a mass movement inside Burma that's connected with those of us in the international community who can back them up and put pressure, targeted pressure on the military and on the military's business empire that we were not able to do in 1988.
Right. Points. Dr. Welsh, so this is not 1988. This is a new generation. The economy is far more integrated with the outside world. I just mentioned in my opening the remarks by the Japanese foreign minister, as also President Joe Biden when he spoke at the State Department. So are you going to see some very firm action against the junta by the outside world? How is this likely to play out?
I think it's important to step back a bit first to recognize that there are serious conflicts inside Myanmar, and that the solutions for the problems in Myanmar will have to come from Myanmar. Beyond the issues in terms of the military are the issues of ethnic conflicts over many parts of the country. And also there are some people in the country that do support military rule. And these are people that have lived and benefited from the military for decades. And I agree that they are a minority, but they are going to have interests that try to make the conflict inside not so easy to resolve. And while we have seen very impressive and very brave protests that have widely participated across the country, I think the real difference now is that the fact is that they have experienced more open political environment and they do not want to go back. You know, people who support Aung San Suu Kyi, many of them support her because she's not the military. And now the international community is faced a very different challenge. What can be done? And I think the solutions for the problems in Myanmar rest in Myanmar itself, but they can put pressure. And I think what we're seeing are somewhat different responses than we saw in the past. In 1988, Myanmar was very isolated, and there wasn't information that was shared. Now we see a very rapid response by the international community. The Japanese have much leverage because of their investment, but also their access to individuals. But it's going to take dialogue from very different sets of actors. Among those are ASEAN, which has already laid out a formula and some suggestions, with hoping to have a special summit on Myanmar within probably the next month and a half. We also see the important role of China as being able to come on board. Now, most people see China as supporting the coup, but in fact, I think that it's not in China's interest for the situation to continue as it is, because it's going to become much more confrontational as more and more people come out to the streets to protest what has happened.
Right. Welsh, I would want you to sort of explain to me, I get the gist of what you're saying with reference to the solutions lie in Myanmar. But my point is that this is a state entity where A, the army is a political player, and B, it's an armed political player, and C, that, it is also the state's coercive apparatus. So the pitch is already queered in terms of the kind of conversations that need to be, have inside in terms of addressing the various fault lines. So my point is that perhaps before one can begin to actually get the solutions from within Myanmar, something needs to be done to clear the pitch where everyone, all interests, can come and speak and can be aggregated through a political process.
I think it's difficult because the military in Myanmar doesn't really engage, and it has its own rationale for doing what it is, and it doesn't listen. And so it's going to take multiple sets of actors to engage in different types of strategies. So some of those strategies have already started, which involve targeted sanctions of individual military personnel and their families and some companies. But the fact of the matter is, and to use your analogy as a cricket situation, is that the test has started, and it's very difficult to clear the pitch in this environment. You have to keep bowling in order to try to get the situation moving forward.
Right. Let me pull in Billenness on this. Mr. Billenness, I want to get your take on what Dr. Welsh has been saying with reference to the internal fault lines and the fact that the solutions lie within Myanmar.
I entirely agree. With Ms. Welsh. The solution does lie within Myanmar, and the solution lies with the civil disobedience movement that's grown up so quickly and so powerfully. And so I see the role of us in the international community is backing up the civil disobedience movement. The civil disobedience movement is calling for targeted sanctions on the Myanmar military and their business empire. Inside Burma, they're already boycotting all military company products. And we're backing up that call by putting pressure on foreign investors like we did with Kirin, the Japanese beer giant. We successfully put pressure on Kirin to end its partnership with the Myanmar military. We're going after Facebook. We're going after Cloudflare to end and to ban the military from their platforms, and particularly Cloudflare to stop protecting the websites of the Home Ministry and other military-owned and military-controlled entities. And so what we're going to do is we're going to back up the civil disobedience movement in the way that they are asking us to do so. We're going to go after the companies and industries that are bankrolling the military. We're going to go after the oil and gas industries like Chevron and Total of France. We're going to go after the banks that are in joint ventures with military-owned banks. We're going to press for the international payments system like SWIFT to stop processing and kick out military-owned banks. We're going to go after every source of income that the military has. We're going to go after gems, rubies and jade, which the military uses to get billions of dollars of income. We're putting pressure on luxury jewelers like Harry Winston, which is owned by Swatch of Switzerland, to stop selling jewelry containing Burmese gems. The military depends on the flow of money from the international community, and we are going to cut that off.
Right. I suspect that this story is unfolding, and I will have more occasions to speak with both Dr. Welsh and Simon Billenness. And let's hope things begin to unfold in the right direction. But for now, I've run out of time. So thank you, Dr. Bridget Welsh. Thank you, Simon Billenness, for speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.